Hey guys, it's Lydia, back with another podcast with my fellow co-hosts Anton Carbonell and Sarah Tran. In this podcast, we're going to be discussing Black disenfranchisement, which is one of many reasons why Reconstruction failed. We're going to be breaking down Black disenfranchisement and explaining its effects on today's society.
There was a time in American history where slaves were free and Black people were flourishing. But sadly, all good things must come to an end. After Abraham Lincoln died and Andrew Johnson became president, the culture of America basically shifted. It allowed most of the South to oppress Black people again, and they did this politically too, making it socially okay, like with poll taxes and literacy tests, which we will be diving into, and talk about how we see these type of problems today.
Literacy tests were one of the ways southern states restricted blacks from voting, along with poll taxes, which Lydia will get into later. A literacy test was given to assess one's ability to read and write, and it was a test you had to pass if you wanted to vote. But don't you think that's kind of messed up considering the amount of uneducated blacks there were post-Civil War?
Yeah, I do think that is messed up, because how would they expect the Black people to know all of the things?
Yeah, and be well educated.
The test, yeah, when they spent all that time
being enslaved. Yeah, I agree. The 15th Amendment states that everyone has the right to vote, but giving the test in general was just in the way of that.
Exactly, yeah, what we said earlier.
During this time, grandfather clauses were introduced, which permitted registering anyone whose grandfather who was qualified to vote before the war, but this was really only beneficial to white citizens. The test was unfair because the clerk, the person who decided if you were illiterate or not, was white. Not only did this test exclude most of the ex-slaves who could not read or write, but almost all black men. The clerk would give them extremely hard passages for them to interpret, but of course this was not the case for whites, which was very predictable. Most of the whites got easy passages to interpret and would pass the test easily. But literacy tests were not the only restriction that kept the blacks from voting. Poll taxes also played a big role.
Yeah, poll taxes did really play a big role. They were created by people in the South who wanted to kind of work around the 15th Amendment.
Oh, so just like literacy tests.
Exactly. The 15th Amendment allowed anyone to vote despite their race. In 1871, a year after the 15th Amendment was created, the poll tax is proposed, but it wasn't until 1876 that it was actually succeeded by Virginia. It seems like white people really didn't want black people to vote, but why?
Yeah, I think you would see this dynamic throughout history. Each time a white person sees a black person taking a step in society, saying like with voting, that will kind of like intimidate the white people.
Yeah, I see that as well too. But like, you kind of just answered my next question, which was, why was black people voting such a bad thing? And I agree with what you said, that white people feel intimidated by black people whenever it seems like black people are taking a step in society. White people are really intimidated by that because throughout history they've always been on the top. And once they see that's kind of like changing, they don't like it. And especially by black people. So that was a great point. And referring to what Sarah said, about how could anyone expect black people to be educated? It's the same thing with paying to vote. How could anyone expect ex-slaves to pay to vote? White people knew what they were doing when they set up poll taxes up. They knew black people wouldn't be able to pay for it, which is really fucked up.
You guys remember watching the movie Selma and Dr. King led that march over the bridge?
Yeah.
To remind you, that march was actually about voting. After the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, people were still finding ways to prevent black people from voting, like the reasons you talked about earlier. This was all leading up to 1965. This year was when the Voting Rights Act was signed into law and outlawed the difficult literacy tests and the poll taxes. And now mainly black people could exercise the right to vote. And just think of the March on Selma and what people had to go through just to have the right to vote.
I think it was a peaceful protest, but when the cops showed up with tear gas and other materials to control the riot, it disrupted their peace.
Yeah. To think that was 50 years ago, how about today? Do you think it's still happening today? In 2013, the outcome of the case Shelby versus Holder removed the main reason for the Voting Rights Act. This caused states to introduce restrictive laws, yet again affecting people's rights to vote.
What Sarah said about the protests in the movie, it made me think about what I see today in today's protests. Like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement is a huge movement and it causes a lot of tension because it's really powerful. Whenever I see a Black Lives Matter protest happening, I see that police show up with tear gas and just extra weapons. And the only reason that they have to go that far is because they're intimidated by the powerful movement. It has always been that way. White people being intimidated by Black people on the come up.
One modern law was known as monster laws, especially in North Carolina. They would cut a week of early voting, eliminate out-of-precinct voting, and required voters to show like really specific types of photo ID. And then this would just affect Black people, and not to mention other minorities. To fully restore back the Voting Rights Act, Congress must pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Okay, today I'll be talking to Reverend William Barber II, the president of North Carolina's NAACP chapter. We're here to talk about these monster laws in North Carolina. Glad you could join us today, Reverend.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I've read an article from the Washington Post, and you said these laws speak for themselves. Can you elaborate more on that?
So you didn't hear about fraud in North Carolina until blacks started voting in large numbers. Then all of a sudden there's a problem with how people are voting.
Have you heard of any speculation surrounding these laws?
So people keep asking, when they passed this law, were they racist in their heart? It doesn't matter. You look at the heart of their policies. If I tell you this law is going to affect black people more than anyone else, and you still go ahead and do it, you yourself are making clear exactly what you are.
Finally, what do you think about politicians trying to disenfranchise black people by deterring their voting rights?
You can't expect racists to come right out and sound like racists. They've substituted the word racial with the word political.
Unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. I hope you all enjoyed our podcast of Black Disenfranchisement, and I hope to catch you the next time. This is your host, Lydia Surchance, signing off.